Hey all, here I will explain the concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Just to let you know, these are the two tools which we will use to explain inflation and recession. This is a variable price output model. That means both price and real gross domestic product can change in this model. And we can look at different time periods when we look at the concept of aggregate supply. Now, what is an aggregate demand curve or an aggregate demand schedule? So, this schedule or curve shows the amount of economy's real gross domestic product that buyers collectively desire to buy at each possible price level. And we will see there is an inverse relation between price and real gross domestic product. That means if price increases, the real gross domestic product demanded, this will decrease. And this happens because of the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. So before we circle back to these three effects, I want to show you how the aggregate demand curve look like. This looks exactly as the demand curve, and the components of real gross domestic product, which is on the horizontal axis, is the same as what we did in the chapter on GDP. This is equal to consumption, investment, government purchases, and X minus M, which is net exports. And we have price level on the vertical axis. So we talked about different buyers. Unlike the chapter on demand and supply, where we only looked at the relationship between price and how many units of a good the consumer is buying, here we look at four different buyers. Like we look at households, we look at farms, we look at government, and we also look at foreign purchases. Okay, now let's go back to why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So first of all, I want us to look at the real balances effect. So we look at a cause and we look at these three effects. So let the cause be an increase in prices. So price increases. Now you are a consumer here. What happens when price increases? So when a price increases, the purchasing power of money, or I'll just say dollar, this goes down definitely. So price increase will erode the value of your dollar. And as a result, your savings will go down. The consumer spending, this is also gonna go down when price is going up. So basically this C part of aggregate demand, this goes down. So you have lower consumption spending. So now looking at this graph here, let's say the price was $100 before and the quantity of real GDP demanded was 100. Now the price increases from 100 to 120 and the quantity of real GDP demanded goes down from 100 to 80. And these are again some random numbers I'm using here. So because this consumption goes down, we move along the aggregate demand curve from point A to point B, and the level of real GDP demanded also is going to go down. Now let's look at the interest rate effect. So we say that when price increases, what would people do? You want to demand more money. So an increase in prices will increase the money demand. When money demand increases, let me just take off a little bit. So let's just make some space here. Let's say what happens when demand for money increases. Just remember that money supply, this one is controlled by the Federal Reserve Bank. This is fixed. So basically the graph is like this. So we have interest rate on the vertical axis, and we have the quantity of money that's on the horizontal axis. So this one is my money supply curve. Let's say this is MS. Now this one is the money demand curve. Let's say they intersect at equilibrium interest rate. Say this is equal to 6%. Now when prices are going up, demand for money is increasing. So this money demand curve will shift up, and we have an equilibrium at a higher interest rate. So basically your interest rate is going up. Now from one of the chapters we did before, where we looked at different relations, so there is a relation between this interest rate and the level of investment. So we had the investment demand curve, which was downward sloping. So this was what we did on chapter 10. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of investment. On the vertical axis, we have the price of investment, which is the interest rate. Always remember, we have quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. Say the interest rate is 6% and investment is 200 million. Now say the interest rate is increasing from 6% to 7%. This will decrease the quantity of investment, say from 200 million to 180 million. What happens as a result of that? So businesses, they want to borrow less money. They want to invest less money here. So interest rate is up. Investment is definitely down. And this is also responsible for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. I had the same graph as before when I was looking at the real balances effect. We move from point A to point B, and the quantity of real GDP demanded, that goes down. Okay. Now the other effect is the foreign purchases effect. So what is our assumption here? Our assumption is US prices increases, but prices anywhere in the world are staying the same. So I'm going to look at this X minus M part of aggregate demand curve. X is exports, M is imports. Let's say initially my exports are equal to $100 million, my imports are equal to $80 million. So the net exports is equal to $20 million. Now looks like US prices went up. So US would want to do what? They would want to import more. So people in US, they want to import more, and say this went up from 80 all the way to 90. and foreigners would want to buy less US goods because US prices went up. Now look at this export part. This means US is going to export less to other countries. So basically this net exports, this went down from $20 million to $5 million only because prices has gone up in the US and US imports went up. US want to buy more foreign goods, and at the same time US exports, this went down. And this is also responsible for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, because if this happens, the real GDP demanded, that will go down. Okay, now I'm going to look at what shifts the aggregate demand curve. So this aggregate demand is made up of 4 components that are consumption, investment, then we have government expenses, then we have X minus M, which is net exports. If any of this increases, this aggregate demand will shift to the right. If any of this decreases, aggregate demand will shift to the left. As you can see here, AD1 is the initial aggregate demand curve. So when aggregate demand increased, initially we moved from this AD1 line to this dashed line, but finally due to some multiplier effect, we move from this dashed line all the way to this part, this curve. So this multiplier effect means the final increase in aggregate demand, this one is greater than the initial increase in aggregate demand. However, if aggregate demand decreases, initially we move from AD1 to this dashed line, and then due to the multiplier effect, the final decrease in aggregate demand will be greater than the initial decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so next what we do is, so here we have just written down the components of consumption spending. If any of this is up, aggregate demand, this one shifts to the right, and vice versa. Now the components of investment spending, like real interest rate, if this increases, investment spending goes down and aggregate demand will shift to the left. If expected returns increases, aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay, now then we have government spending. Definitely this increases, aggregate demand will shift to the right. Then we have net export spending, national income abroad, this increases, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Exchange rate, if US dollar depreciates or goes down in value, US goods are cheaper compared to foreign goods. This situation, aggregate demand will shift to the right. And if US dollar appreciates, that means US goods are more expensive compared to the rest of the world. Here aggregate demand will shift to the left, just to let you know. So this part, X minus M, increases, and when US dollar appreciates, X minus M, this whole thing decreases. All right, that's all about the movement along the aggregate demand curve, and this one where you looked at the movement along the aggregate demand curve and the shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right and to the left. Thank you very much.